And good morning, good afternoon to those who are joining us in other parts of the world. My name is Dipali Mukhopadhyay, and I'm delighted to be convening this final conversation for History Week, which has been a marvelous collection of discussions about the study of Afghan history. And I encourage all of you, if you've missed previous conversations, to please visit the Insan Facebook page or the Kakar Foundation Facebook page, and you can watch those past discussions. In this panel, we will conclude this week of rich discussions by bringing ourselves to the current moment and reflecting on where the study of Afghanistan stands and where it is moving. I'm delighted to welcome three colleagues into the conversation whose diversity of backgrounds and perspectives and their rich contributions to scholarship on Afghanistan make them an ideal cohort for our purposes. So let me first introduce each of them to you in alphabetical order, in the order that we will hear from them. And then I'll just make a few opening comments. So we'll first hear from Dr. Thomas Barfield, who is professor of anthropology at Boston University and is the president of the American Institute of Afghan Studies. Among his many influential publications, I will highlight his 2010 book with Princeton University Press, Afghanistan, A Cultural and Political History. We will then hear from Dr. Syed Askar Mousavi, who is also an anthropologist, has taught at numerous Afghan universities, and authored, among many publications, his Kurzan Press 1998 book, The Hazaras of Afghanistan. Dr. Mousavi established the Afghanistan Studies program at Oxford University and served as chief advisor to the Ministry of Higher Education in Afghanistan between 2003 and 2013. And finally, we will hear from Dr. Omar Sadr, who is assistant professor of political science at the American University of Afghanistan. And most recently, he is the author of Negotiating Cultural Diversity in Afghanistan, which is a book that came out in 2020 with Routledge. And Dr. Sadr is also a research fellow at the Afghan Institute of Strategic Studies. So before I turn the floor over to each of them to make 15 minutes or so of remarks, I would like to set the stage for our discussion with a few reflections of my own. I began studying Afghanistan in the summer of 2001 and went deeper into my inquiry after my first visit to the country in 2004. And as a student at the time, I was struck by, broadly speaking, two categories of literature that inspired my own work on political violence and state formation. So the first was this set of rich ethnographic and archival studies of state-society relations that upended the myth of Afghanistan's ungovernability and offered up complex models for us of governance, of nation-making, and development that could not be reduced to the simplistic binaries of modern versus traditional, or center versus periphery, or nation versus tribe. And second, I encountered the compelling work of scholars who studied Afghanistan's place in the world, buffeted between great powers and nestled within rich civilizations. And I can't miss this opportunity to say that for me, it was Hasan Kakar's work, which I read at Professor Barfield's insistence, that helped me to understand the inextricable links between Afghanistan's inner life as a country and its geopolitical position. Kakar exposed this dysfunctional but resilient relationship between domestic rule and foreign interests in Afghanistan. And the way he conceived of that relationship continues to be relevant to me as a scholar of modern Afghan politics and Western intervention. So since that time when I first began studying Afghanistan, I think the multiple disciplines that explore the subject of Afghan politics and history have really evolved. And I want to just highlight three developments and then turn the floor to my colleagues. I think first we see a wealth of studies, including by many of the participants in this conference, that marry careful and original fieldwork with big theoretical thinking that has moved insights about Afghanistan from the particular to the general in new ways on topics as far-ranging as Islamic governance, feminist politics, warlordism, nationalism, and democracy. We also see studies that have brought many different social scientific methods to bear, taking advantage of the Western intervention after 2001 to study Afghan politics and society, but as importantly, to expose and critique and unsettle Western ideas and habits that have for too long gone unchallenged among academics and policymakers alike. And finally, in my mind, most importantly, we see the emergence of communities and institutions that center scholarly voices and questions native to Afghanistan and rooted in the country's success, in its struggles, in its suffering. And our colleagues, our Afghan colleagues, many of whom have participated in this conference, are authors publishing work that demands international respect and attention. And they are also professors teaching the next generation of Afghan scholars. So I hope part of the conversation today, we can spend some time reflecting on how best we can take up this sacred responsibility of ensuring that their work is safeguarded, that it's encouraged, and that it's sustained. So with that, let me turn over to Professor Barfield. Professor Barfield, please unmute yourself and we'll hear from you now.
Thank you very much, Dipali. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, particularly by the foundation, because I got interested in Afghanistan. I realize now it's the year 2021, 50 years ago, which is when I first came to Afghanistan as a student, not as a scholar. But I returned because I found the place so fascinating, so interesting. And some of the first work that I did when I was a graduate student at Harvard, I went to the library, I wrote papers, and I was very proud of a paper that I got an A on, that I took to Professor Hassan Kakar, who was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard. A week later, I got it back and it was full of red marks. He says, "This is entirely wrong." And I was very disappointed. He says, "But it's not your fault. You quoted all the sources carefully. They just happen to be wrong." And that was an indication, as he put it, that not everything that's published on Afghanistan is true, and that it requires careful looks. And his scholarship, particularly on the reign of Emir Abdurrahman, was incredibly careful, and also, at the time, politically controversial. And I would say, for those who have not read Professor Kakar's work on Abdurrahman, given the attention that Abdurrahman gets in current Afghan politics as a model for governance, they should return to Professor Kakar's work to see actually how he did govern. It's very much an eye-opener, and it was something that really only an Afghan scholar could do. It used many foreign archives, but it was his knowledge of Afghanistan, and particularly documents that were not available in archives in Afghanistan, but as many scholars know, are often available in the bazaar. That the work of history in Afghanistan still today is searching out sources. And there are many sources that are still out there that throw light on parts of Afghanistan history that have been buried or ignored. So let me just say, looking at Afghanistan's history relatively briefly, it follows a trajectory. Before the 20th century, what we see is our histories are largely dynastic histories. They're not about the country, they're about the people that ruled it. In the 20th century, particularly when Afghanistan becomes independent, we begin to get nationalist histories. But these are histories, by and large, that are supported by the monarchy. They tell the tale of Afghanistan as if it was entirely the result of a line of the descendants of Ahmad Shah Durrani that created Afghanistan and should be entitled to rule Afghanistan forever. What is missing in that is the diversity of Afghanistan. And those of us who had the opportunity to work in pre-war Afghanistan in many different parts of the country realized that much of the history of Afghanistan was actually buried, in some cases actively suppressed, but in other cases simply ignored. I was in northern Afghanistan, has large Tajik, Uzbek, Turkmen populations. And their point of view on what happened in Afghanistan's history was very different than what was coming out in Kabul. But it's not something that you could read about. It was not something that was known about. It had been relegated to the sidelines. And Afghanistan is not alone in this type of history. If we look at almost all new nations, and by contrast, Afghanistan is not really a new nation, becoming independent more than 100 years ago, was the only independent Muslim state at the end of the First World War. So much deeper roots than, let's say, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. But nevertheless, there was a desire to place history as the result of a nationalist conception pushed backwards. So we talk about Afghanistan or Uzbekistan back in the Paleolithic. There were obviously no Afghanistan, Uzbekistan back in the Paleolithic. There was not even an Afghanistan as we know it today 300 years ago. And one of the things that's really important is, I would say, that's come about relatively recently, is a combination of more work by international scholars that dominated a lot of the history of Afghanistan, but it's the contribution of Afghan scholars that's really made a difference in terms of a perspective. But I think one of the most important things that we have to look at is, again, if the monarchy and then the republic and then the PDPA were pushing particular kinds of history, often very nationalist history, the opposite of that, that is creating histories for every ethnic group as if they were entirely separate from everyone else, is also a path that leads us into not understanding the fact that Afghanistan has always been a place of interaction, not of separate groups. As I've written before, it's not the Balkans. No ethnic group in Afghanistan ever pushed for independence or to break up the country. This is different than other places. But what we have seen is a fluorescence now of new studies about peoples whose voices were silenced, or certainly had a different point of view about Afghan rulers or their policies. And we're seeing a wider range of documentation. But I think the biggest challenge that still exists in terms of looking at history is what I would call is breaking the 1747 barrier. Is that I noticed as a student, Afghanistan seems to begin at 1747, and everything else is sort of left to the sidelines. And in fact, obviously, Afghanistan as a place has a history that's much longer than that. But the problem is, if you're a government, is that Afghanistan as it currently is composed politically was composed differently. The background behind me is a Timurid mosque in Herat, used to be on the 10 Afghani note under the monarchy. Famous mosque, famous dynasty, but where do the Timurids lie in terms of Afghan history? It's as if they're not part of Afghan history. There's something else. And that fails to understand the continuity of Afghan history. Recently, past couple of years, American Institute of Afghanistan Studies, with the cooperation of others, was fortunate to help mount an exhibition of Timurid art, which is currently on display in Herat. And Herat at that time was the capital of the Timurid Empire. Some of the most fantastic art, pictorial art, ever produced in the Muslim world was done out of that city. And yet, these paintings are called Persian miniatures, as if the people living in Herat, living in Balkh, didn't exist and didn't produce them. This is the type of thing in which Afghanistan's culture and its history has often been neglected by the way in which we define history itself. And an integrated aspect of history would show there's not been one ethnic group that has a monopoly on ruling Afghanistan or providing governments for Afghanistan. If one goes back as far as the Persian Empire, 500 BC, we find that practically every group in Afghanistan has not only participated in running Afghanistan, at one time or another has actually run it. Figuring out how this happens, what the relationship is between politics and government in Afghanistan, I think is one of the important aspects of history. Now, I think now I have been talking about sort of old history, but I think one of the most interesting things that's happened in the past 20 years has been the explosion of interest in history in Afghanistan by Afghans themselves, but as producers rather than consumers of history. When I ask my students to look at sort of the culture of the United States, one of the books that I have them read is Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America. He was a Frenchman. He just visited America. How can he write about that? Why should we read him? This is the type of thing that there's a combination between outsiders looking at a society. They can sometimes see things that insiders take for granted or don't understand the significance of. But at the same time, privileging the outside view or the international view warps essentially how do the people themselves who experience the culture, who live the country, how do they see it? And what I've been very pleased to see in Afghanistan is much more of a dialogue. Yes, as international perspective, which is a fairly long tradition about Afghanistan, if often a fairly simplistic one in terms of analysis. But Afghan intellectuals, I would say, when I knew Professor Kakar in the early 70s, people were proud to say, well, we have an Afghan with a PhD. We now have lots of people with PhDs, with lots of people with disciplines, different disciplines, and they're all contributing different perspectives. And I would say now as an official old person, they're all young too. One of the most important things I think for both the history of Afghanistan and the politics of Afghanistan is that people like me who can be on the Rish Safid side, they can talk about old stuff and are old ourselves. And Afghanistan gives a lot of respect to the old, more than America. But there's also been new light by younger people who are bringing new perspectives, new issues that have never been written about in Afghanistan before. And what we are finding looking at new histories of Afghanistan is that we are looking at new avenues of understanding Afghanistan. But I'm particularly pleased with the fact that when I wrote my Afghanistan book in 2010, I said, too often Afghanistan has been a type of opera in which the Afghans are a turban chorus and the foreigners take the lead. And one of the things that we're seeing now is that Afghanistan has produced its own playwrights, has produced its own characters. And we realize there's not one way of looking at Afghanistan, but there's many ways of looking at Afghanistan. And one of the things that I'm most pleased to see and will continue into the future is the diversity of voices that will bring us, I think, a rounder understanding of Afghanistan that's not centered on the peculiarities that have dominated history in the past, that break away from the tropes of ethnicity or narrow dynastic politics or this or that, but they can actually talk about what is the Afghanistan today? What does the past have to do with it? And what does the past have to mean for Afghanistan's future? So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barfield. That was wonderful. Dr. Mousavi? And please unmute yourself, yes.
Yeah. Yes. I think I missed the first part of the opening, and I joined. When I joined, you were talking about, do I have 10 minutes or how many?
15 minutes, doctor. 15.
15. Okay. Well, Dr. Barfield was very good, and he finished exactly on the time which you allowed us. Okay, thank you for everybody, and especially to Tom Barfield, which we haven't seen since the last time in South Korea. I remember in South Museum, opening of new National Museum of South Korea, where we met. The most of what I was supposed to say somehow touched by Barfield. What I would do, I will go this way, the way I would like to go. And sorry, I'm a student of anthropology, and as Dr. Barfield and as Dr. Ghani, and I suppose Nuristani is also, he was, and he's in jail, I suppose. But anyway, there are two approaches to history in Afghanistan. One is a formal state-owned history of Afghanistan, which Dr. Barfield in detail suggested. That history could have two parts from my point of view. One is up to 1919, which we had some sort of historiography. And the best example is the Siraj al-Tawarikh by Khatib. That is a typical old style history in our part of the world, done by Iranian, by Indian, by everybody, especially in Persian speaking area. We used to have produced this kind of historiography. And usually you started from Adam as Khatib started it and finished it to Habibullah. That is one tradition of history. The other kind of history, which is modern history, I refer to it as nationalist history, which Dr. Barfield also suggested as a nationalist approach to history of Afghanistan. The first part of the history of Afghanistan is now looking again into it again by new scholars. And the second part has been looking at by foreigners and Afghans again and again and again. The verdict from our side, that's the Afghan scholars, including a student of social science like me, that we don't have a history of such. Whatever we have is a fabricated history by the state, that is Afghanistan state, from 1920s onwards. The root started from 1920s. So there are lots of critiques, lots of rewriting, lots of reapproach to this history, and this is widely rejected, and there's no trust on it at all, even by those who teach this history in schools, universities, elsewhere. The other point is we haven't managed to offer a new approach to history or a new history of Afghanistan or modern Afghanistan. That is, I think, something would be the outcome of this generation. Maybe in the next 20, 30 years, we may have some sort of evidence-based history by foreigners, by Afghans. I totally agree that it doesn't make someone to be Afghans, then he should have the first priority to think, to write about Afghanistan. No, I think it is a piece of science, social sciences. As long as one is a scientist and has an interest and prepared with discipline, then he or she would be allowed to write about not Afghanistan, anybody. As some Afghans would write maybe in the third or second generation in the United States, one day they would start writing on America, or most of Afghans start writing about Iran or Central Asia and so on and so forth. So what is we are waiting for exactly the next generation. What we did, we prepared the ground. In the introduction of my book, I openly suggested we don't have history. This is not history of a nation called Afghanistan. So we have to rethink about rewrite the whole thing. Now, a couple of new books. Actually, the title of the books are as Rethinking the History of Afghanistan. Mr. Mohammadi, who just published, he published many books, but he just published a new book, and he's rejecting almost everything we have since 1920s after Siraj al-Tawarikh, has nothing to do with Afghanistan history. Now, one approach is that in 42 years exactly, maybe about 43 years ago, when I first published Mr. Obar's book on the history of Afghanistan, which is general history of Afghanistan. Last year, I also published Mr. Asif Ahang's history on Afghanistan. This is from the same society, political society, Watan society, called Jamiyati Watan. Now, there is a new approach in Asif Ahang's book. Ahang argued that up to 1747, we have one history with Iran, with some part of regions which we are in it. So the history of region is the history of Afghanistan. We don't have an independent history except the history of whatever we have in the northern part of Afghanistan. We share with those emirates in northern Afghanistan, northern Oxus. We shared most of the parts with Indian, and of course the majority goes with Iranian. And this is with Iranian is much deeper, goes back to maybe about 1,000 to 2,000 whatever years, as it was suggested by Dr. Barfield as well. This is a general history. So we should have one history for the whole region, and maybe with some changes going here and there. So we are part of the region, we are part of the history of the region, we are part of the civilization, whatever is or used to be in the region. And the second part of history started when we have modern states. When new nation appeared in the geography, well, gradually, some people think that it started 1747. In our part, that is in Afghanistan, I think it took about from 1747 up to 1880 to have a shape of something like a history or a nation state. Probably the first ever nation state would have started from 1880. That is Abdurrahman. Bad or good, this nation, this country built by Abdurrahman, the geography for the first time, boundaries built by Afghanistan, by Abdurrahman. So this is a new state, a new country, a new geography. Then we could have a history for this new geography. Whatever we have is somewhere in between 1747 up to 1880. We should carefully read it as it is. We don't have some sort of structure to put it here and there. Whatever we have is a fabrication. Now, the modern history, which started from 1880 onwards up to now, again, it comes up to 1919 That is the end of Habibullah coming to power by Amanullah. We have some sort of traditional history, historiography, and the nationalist, ethnocentric nationalist history started from exactly when the second constitutional movement or Amanullah comes to power. From here, we have the elements of today's society which we are in it, where good or bad. Many problems, the roots of could be searched, could be looked at exactly at this from this period onward. Nationalist movement was an ideology attractive by all intellectuals. Ghubar himself proudly called that he is a nationalist, an Afghan nationalist, a Muslim nationalist. Then from this nationalist, we also from this intellectual nationalist, the left wing, the first generation of left wing came to power. They added some element of the left, well, in this case, communist approach to history. For the first time, we have phrases, languages of communist approach to history in the writing of this generation, the first left wing of Afghanistan. Whatever was either left wing or right wing or nationalist or whatever, the history was fabricated based on either reaction to Iranian history, that is changing the name of the country, based on the reaction to Indian history, where some sort of Islamized, some sort of ethnized approach to the East, or somehow some sort of silence approach towards the northern axis, that's northern Afghanistan. The history also dominated by a very racist, fascist approach to history. So this is what we have. Unfortunately, we don't have an evidence-based history so far. Most of foreign scholars, unfortunately, there is a borrowing and giving. Many information, false, fabricated, were borrowed from us by foreigners, was typically by English, and they reproduced it to these people here. And then here in Afghanistan, they looked at those whatever writing, foreign writing, English writing, mostly English, mostly from Great Britain, as became the main reference to write history. Now, afterward, most of Afghans also concentrated at those references as something very scientific, academic, and so on and so forth. Even now, you could see many people think that, for example, the Hazaras of the remain of Chinese Hans, okay? And someone with a great understanding and scholarship and so on, so especially very easily would say so. I read recently by someone saying that the Pashtuns are the Jews coming from, there's actually a dissertation, a thesis in Oxford, that the lost tribe of Israel, well, they found themselves in Mumbai, and then they gradually migrated towards northern India, and that's today's Afghanistan. And there are many false approaches to history of Afghanistan. Now, this is the situation. Why we are in this situation? Well, in addition to whatever Dr. Barfield said, I would add a couple of other points. Can you believe that since the second constitutional movement up to now, the government of Afghanistan produced only one historian, and that is thanks to the scholarship by British and by American. That is Professor Hassan Kakar. whether we agree with late Cocker or not, but he was the only person who studied history scientifically and concentrated only on one period, that is Abdurrahman. 20 years of Abdurrahman, 10 years his MSc and MA, and another 10 years his PhD. Whether we whether we have difficulties with his politics or not, but he is and he was the only historian produced by Afghanistan. Somebody who could study history as a scientific approach. No one after Hassan Kakar had any scholarship or studied outside sent by the government or any scholarship. So where these all histories come from? These are all against false reaction to false action. Most of reaction by the Hazaras, it is exactly going to the same path as that is the ethnocentric policies, formal ethnocentric policies. And the Tajiks react exactly the same way. That is to say, the answer of something wrong by doing another wrong. The answer gradually, recently, just to say that the Uzbeks also managing people or fighting some money and paying somebody to write a very good history for the Uzbeks as well, as just another false reaction to false action. We don't have history. We have a history department. Surprise, surprise, we have two departments of history at the University of Kabul. One is contemporary history, one is old history. That is to say, we study the evolution of human and so on. So now, all of these departments repeating the same false documents, the false books, false approaches, false scholarships, so forth. So we have to think about, I think I must be very shameful of myself to have a history week in Afghanistan where we don't have, even in last 20 years, I was the Minister of Higher Education. I don't remember if we sent somebody, she or he, to go and study history scientifically and return and teach in Afghanistan. So there is no week of history. There's no history to have a week of history. There's nothing to celebrate, unfortunately. And so we well, and even some scholars, foreign scholars, they're friends, scholars of mine, of all of us, didn't like my approach to their works. For example, translation of Siraj al-Tawarikh, the way it was produced by Professor McChesney, I suggested something that we have to be very careful about these elements. Now, if you are talking about these elements, suddenly you were labeled as politically as being one side and another side. So,
Dr. Mousavi, I'm so sorry to interrupt you.
Just 1 minute. Can you give me 1 minute?
Yes,
okay.
I can. Yes.
What I suggest, if you could help, if those in Afghanistan, in government and politics, and even people at the American Institute for Afghanistan Studies, American University, Dr. Barfield in the United States, I think one of the best contribution is to introduce a couple of scholarships and ask young people to go and study history scientifically, evidence-based, and then return back and then maybe teach a new approach to history. We may end up with some sort of history in Afghanistan in the future. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to go over to my time.
Not at all. Thank you so much, Dr. Mousavi. We are meant to be joined now by Dr. Omar Sadr, but he's just dropped off from the Zoom. So while we wait for him to join us, maybe I can ask Professor Barfield to just begin the reflection on one of the questions I plan to pose to the group, and then we'll turn it to Dr. Sadr when he returns. I'm wondering how both of you and Dr. Sadr feel about the impact of the increasingly difficult security situation in Kabul and across the country, but more generally, the nature of the war and the nature of the insurgency that the Taliban is fighting. What impact you believe that has had and is having and will continue to have on the production of knowledge, and how can those of us who seek to encourage precisely the kind of work Dr. Mousavi was referencing just now, how can we be supportive and responsive in this particular moment?
Well, I would say that looking at the past in Afghanistan, there have been a number of historians that have lived through very difficult periods and written about them. Thinking of the Civil War in 1929. The thing is, they weren't writing history at the time. They were documenting what is going on. We turned it into history. But I think one of the important things is the realization that a place like Afghanistan it's more than ups and downs, but periods of difficulty, periods of calm, but that what has always come through is people's perseverance, and that includes intellectual perseverance. And what I would say to some extent, and it is interesting that anthropology actually is far more represented in Afghan studies than most other places. Dr. Mousavi and I are both anthropologists, and yet here we are talking about history. It's correct. We should be in the audience, not giving that in another country. But the important thing of Afghanistan has such a past that it's been through this before. In 175 years, Afghanistan has seen the British twice, the Soviets once, and the Americans once. It's not like this is the first time. Understanding how Afghans have responded in the past and what paths have led to more destruction and what paths have led to stability, I think is one of the things, the long-term perspective, particularly for a country who's one of the youngest populations in the world, is an indication that of what paths could we take. And I think it's particularly important to understand, at least from my perspective, that a lot of the problems in Afghanistan is been a place of proxy wars. Is to what extent Afghans actually have problems with each other, and to what extent Afghanistan's problems are manipulated by foreigners for their own reasons. And I think that's a really important thing to understand in terms of, can Afghanistan come to peace with itself if people are able to talk among themselves without sort of representing foreign interests. That's throughout Afghanistan's history, foreign interests have always been involved, but I think it's important to realize that.
Dr. Mousavi, can you reflect on that a little bit for a moment? How you would understand the current moment and its relationship to the production of knowledge, and maybe put that into a longer view as well. Let me ask you to unmute yourself.
Sorry, can you repeat again? Sorry.
Yes, just asking you also to reflect a bit on this question of what you think the impact has been and will continue to be of the ongoing war on the production of knowledge, and with a longer view as well, if you like.
Well, yes, again, what Dr. Barfield said, and this is exactly what we should look at the history of the whatever is going on in Afghanistan. Well, the impact of it is disaster. I mean here in Afghanistan, everything somehow dropped comparing to 10 years ago, dropped from, let's say, from hundreds to 20% of effect. The quality of education dropped, the quality of any hope for new generation, the quality of hope for working further for future dropped. Even, fortunately, the quality of fighting for any kind of ethno, tribal or geographic sort of values dropped. And there's no even, there's somebody was joking this saying the other day, if there is a need to fight again, I think nobody is there anymore to fight. I mean, the Mujahideen became so rich, and the leadership of Mujahideen so rich, so corrupt. The new generation became again sort of corrupt. The population left once again as confused as ever. The American once again came here and then produced a very example of something which is, well, we hope many of us, people like us, we knew, but people had a great hope that this time American will come and help to build some sort of foundation for future, which is no longer any hope. Even if American, let's say Biden approach Afghanistan with a completely new understanding, the trust on American is no longer. On the peace, people, they don't believe in it. I had many people suggesting that whatever we have in Afghanistan, we had proxy wars, we have proxy peace. Doha and Geneva are proxy peace. It's nothing to do with us. American went and had peace with sort of Taliban. And they came here and dropped bombs, the mother of bombs, they dropped everything to fight terrorism. Now they're sitting face to face with terrorism, somehow siding with terrorism against whatever kind of nation state or state in Afghanistan. So people are, there is somehow a fragile state and collapsed completely. That is the state of the mind of people. That is the fabric of society. And that is people are once again buying weapons. Buying weapons means that people are getting ready. You don't buy weapons to write an anthropological essay with it. You buy a weapon to get ready for a fight, and everybody is getting for a fight. The security situation in Kabul is as bad as now here. We are almost, that is, I could see Kabul University, I'm as close as that. That after 8 people are not going out, even with machine, even if you have a car, even if you have a machine gun, whatever, because it is almost, there's no police. Even police might be part of the part of the trouble. So that's the situation at the moment. And it is whatever is that people are this time thinking who are coming next, as a jokingly say, well, let's go and bring Chinese for about 20 years and then play with them and replace American with China, and then, well, God will help us, and after Chinese we'll find another person to come here. That is a disaster politically, socially, for a nation, and that is the capital of a nation. To think like this, whatever was built is one by one collapsing in Afghanistan, in the image of people, in future hope, whatever. So God knows what's going to happen, and nobody could anymore. I personally, I escaped from any interview, sort of appearing to television, whatever, on security basis, but also I don't know I don't know what to say. Maybe it's not the job of student of anthropology like us. Even maybe when Tom's is here, maybe he also would have the same experience, what to say, because this is politics and this is politicians should say something.
Mm.
So the situation is a chaos, is a total chaos. And the whatever is this game in Doha, people here, they think they understand, they know the result because they already experienced Geneva Peace Accord in 1992, 1991, 1992, 1989, I suppose. So that is the situation. Very
I
negative, I'm sorry, but that's it.
Well, I mean, I think it's actually important set of cautions. Let me ask one more question to each of you. If we assume some degree of uncertainty about the future, and we think about the fact that Afghan scholars have persisted despite decades of war, I wonder if each of you could reflect a little bit on your wish list of the types of research questions and topics that you would love to see scholars take up in the coming years. And in the meantime, we're going to figure out if Dr. Sadr can join us or not. But I would love, Dr. Barfield, if you could start, if you could dream up a new dissertation topic for a student who's imagining beginning their work in Afghanistan, whether in history or in one of the social sciences. What are the questions that you would love to see answered?
Actually, one of the things that I would say is that I like students to bring dissertation topics to me that I have not thought of. I think one of the problems about being too experienced in a field is that sometimes we don't see possibilities. We don't have breakthroughs. So rather than me be in charge of something, I would rather bless something to help the funding. But I guess going back to Dr. Mousavi's point, I would actually like to see teams focus on regions of Afghanistan, because that way you could focus on their relations to, let's say, Iran, to Central Asia, to India, but in the context of that region. After all, Kabul was the capital of the Mughal Empire for a while. When we did that exhibition in Baki Babur of Mughal art, Afghans were really surprised. This art was produced in our city? Yes, it was. Kabul at that time was very closely related to India. But at the same time, Herat was very closely related to Iran, and Balkh was very closely related to Central Asia. Rather than treat that as a problem, I would like to see teams of people say, how do these different, because I've argued that the regions of Afghanistan are much older than the state of Afghanistan. If you look at the Persian provinces, you see Herat, you see Balkh, you see Kandahar, you see Kabul, they're there. If we focus on that, then we would begin asking, and I would have anthropologists looking in who participated in this, what are the different social structures, but also the documentation of what do we need to look at, but within a regional perspective. But essentially to make, if you will, the history of Afghanistan as a link to the whole region stand out. I've just completed a new book on empires, and as a result, I looked, for example, at the Caliphate, and to realize that essentially Khorasan built the Abbasid Caliphate and moved to Baghdad. Why isn't this part of Afghanistan's history in the Islamic world? Afghanistan, or what we would call today's Afghanistan, Khorasan, was immensely powerful in that. That's entirely missing. And so what I would seek to do is particularly, and I would think it would be worthwhile in terms of teams. One of the problems of Afghanistan is that most of us, like myself, are individual scholars. We do what we do, we write what we write, but we also know how many parts are missing. And if I could organize things that, and I would base it on a region, because I think there's more continuity there. And then we could see, how do regions become part of the modern Afghan state? Because it's interesting that even though we have these very strong regional identities, nobody wants to break Afghanistan apart. I find that to be fascinating as an anthropologist, but also from a political science point of view. But I don't know enough about the pieces. I can make arguments, I can make generalizations, but as Dr. Mousavi was saying, so much of this is actually based on speculation because we don't really have the evidence that we need. And maybe some of these things are wrong. And it would be good to know that you think it's this way, but the documentation shows actually it didn't work out that way. You know, I was really surprised when I was in northern Afghanistan, because I was with, a group, the Central Asian Arabs, that don't speak Arabic, they speak Persian, but claim a very, very long history. And what they described in 1929 going on in northern Afghanistan was very different than what I had read in any kind of history. It's not known. That's what I would like to see. And I believe that would also then, because one of the problems in contemporary Afghanistan, it's gotten less, but it's too Kabul-centric. And without, creating this idea that, well, the place should be broken up, should be put on regions. They don't think that. But I would like to see a more balanced approach, that in terms of even during the 20th century, what was going on in the various regions of Afghanistan, what were the people doing, what was their response to this. But, to be able to form integrated teams that would have political science, anthropology, history, all working together, that would be my ideal.
Sounds fantastic to me. I'd love to join one of those teams. Dr. Mousavi, any questions or topics or concepts that you would like to see future doctoral students take up, whether in anthropology or otherwise? And please unmute yourself for your answer. Oh, you're still on mute, Doctor.
I'm not very good with technology. Well, the first thing I would suggest, they should not read whatever I wrote. Otherwise, they will get, they will miss direction. Well, in addition to what, again, to Dr. Barfield said, that maybe in addition to that, we should think we should reapproach. I have heard that Persian, or Farsi region of civilization, which we are, and somehow we claim we are the origin of Persian language and Persian civilization, whatever. Or now Iranian, whatever. We could somehow settle this with Iranian one day, sooner or later. But anyway, the Islamic geography, we have detailed documentation of every single village, personalities, and so on and so forth, and under the title of Siyahatnama, Taskere, and so on and so forth. And there are thousands of these. The younger generation, the foreigners, they couldn't read it because somehow, it might be very difficult. The younger generation, they completely forget about it. And so to have a real picture from what used to be before this fabrication, even Kabul, what used to be Kabul before this, whatever we have now Kabul as a sort of cultural, historical, whatever. Now, they have to, again, same approach as a team, as having some sort of division of labor, who is doing when and which period, which area, which subject, and so on. So one example is there are many names, there are many areas, historical areas, renamed. Now, no historian, foreigners or Afghan, could find his or her way to the reality of the case, because there's a new name. For example, if somebody changed the name of New York to um, to something else, and then this something else for 50 years introduced, write about, and so on. So you never find anything about New York. You read about New York. One of the disasters of this ethnocentric history is to change the names of peoples, place, and so on and so forth. And so one way is to reapproach once again Afghanistan before 1930s, at least before 1930s. What was looking like, the cities and so on. So, surprise, surprise, there is a new book which is not a new book as such, but anyway, I found it. I bought a copy about 2 years ago that famous Iranian scholars at the time of Reza Khan, that's 1920s, around 1920, 30 somewhere. He says that I took lots of names from the eastern part of Iran, exactly what we are, Afghanistan, and renamed places in Iran, that is today's sort of Persia and Iran, to make Iran more historical, to claim the history of civilization back in Iran. Name of the place, even the name of a mountain. We have a mountain in the northern Afghanistan called Al-Borz. Now, there is another Al-Borz in northern Iran. Now, there is a history, there is a written documents, which is one of the most references for historian, poetry, whatever, called Shahnameh. In the Shahnameh, Ferdowsi is talking about the history, about the piece of history that somebody is called Arash. He went at the top of the Al-Borz and had his arrow shot on the other side, and his arrow hit a tree on the other side of Oxus River. Now, if you want to use the Al-Borz mountain in today's Tehran, northern Tehran, even if you use Russian Scud missiles, you cannot hit northern Oxus in Afghanistan. So it must be this Al-Borz, because nobody wanted to change the name. Even nobody wanted to. Nobody knows, even many people doesn't know that Al-Borz is here. The name of Talakhan, the name of Kerman, many names were stolen, were replaced, were reused by Iranian, because they wanted to create a false history again, like us. We went one direction, they went another direction. So there is a huge work within the region and within this whatever enclave like Afghanistan, Iran, and so on, so to find the reality of the region, to find the reality of the new cities, states, and places. Here in Kabul, well, even for people like me, many names have changed purposely by the government. Why they changed the name? Because they wanted to get rid of the history of the past of this city. You know? So younger generation, they don't know. Young, especially if you're from Afghanistan and were born and grown up in the West, you don't know anymore the city. You follow exactly the same pattern. Names that were used here in Kabul is nothing to do. I didn't remember, and I can hear it for the first time. I was calling one name, and people around me were calling another name. It's not just name. There's a lot of other cultural, historical values which you replace. Either you get rid of it, or you try people to to get to confuse people, to sell them a new sort of product. So could be regionally and also within this geography. We have lots of things shared with Pakistanis, with Indian, and
Yes.
it was as Tom referred to that. Babur, he went from Kabul to India, and he loved Kabul not because many people told me because Kabul was such and such a beautiful city. Kabul never been beautiful city. It is as beautiful as anywhere. Any cities are beautiful. Well, when he was defeated, he came to Kabul. And Kabul helped him, gave him a positive memory. Then he went to India, became king of India, whatever, established the Mughal Empire. This is why he said, please bury me in Kabul. And people say, because Kabul was so beautiful and with trees, lots of false imagination. It's nothing to do with it. Kabul was as it is, as ever. But the identity of Kabul has changed purposely. So a group with knowledge, with no bias, with no prejudice, should be trained properly, should be trained scientifically, that they should return in a team. Very good suggestion. In a team, they should concentrate on Herat. They should and just now, Dr. Barfield, there is a conference in Iran, webinar. There's a webinar in Iran on Omar Lais. Omar Lais, historically, he was from Herat, a Sistani from Herat, who rose against Arab, and he started the whole business of Khorasan or whatever, Persian and so on. Now, we have no single person in current days of Afghanistan to know Omar Lais. Who was Omar Lais? No one knows about. So of course Iranians say Omar Lais was a good Iranian and some Iranian in the sort of today's business. Now what they say, because they lose the sight of reality, they create in their imagination people never existed. We have lots of these people never existed. They create some sort of famous history. Even Dr. Ashraf Ghani, as an anthropologist, he said we have 5,000 history of Afghanistan. 5,000 history of Afghanistan. Somebody, a journalist, asked him, can you believe the journalist, a young journalist asked the president that, would it be good to have 200 years history as American or 5,000 history as Afghanistan and be in this situation? So there's a lot of false approach to everything. And we need a whole generation of new scholars trained, thousands of them in different subjects, in different areas, to come here and work to show the face of reality.
Wonderful. Well, I think there should be many PhD applications beginning after all of these suggestions. I'm delighted to welcome Omar Sadr into the conversation, who is one of the bright lights of the new generation of Afghan academia. Omar, why don't you take 15 minutes? And then I'm also going to take advantage of the fact that Omar Sharifi is on the call. I'll introduce him and he can make a couple of closing comments. Dr. Sadr, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you, Dipali. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
All right, great. It's a pleasure to be in this panel with great scholars from Afghanistan and from United States. And also, I would like to extend my gratitude to Kokar Foundation and Sun Institution for initiating this wonderful 1 week of history on Afghanistan. I will put a couple of points on the table, and maybe later on we can discuss them in detail. I will not repeat many things which was discussed earlier by both professors speaking before me. Number one is that Afghanistan, as far as I see, I mean the people in this region, we do not much differentiate between history and what is mythology. And that's my kind of understanding. For example, when I read Shahnameh, or the time Shahnameh was written, you see how history connects with mythology. Ferdowsi himself starts history from very ancient time, and the time which was not even, there wasn't written historiography. So this is not a kind of product of modern era or modern state, wherein, of course, nationalism connects with with myth and mythology. But you see, Ferdowsi was writing in Ghazni at the time of Ghaznavid. So somehow that kind of common memory that we have in here is connected between, something is connected between myth and history. That's number one. Second, I also think that unlike many other regions in South Asia, Afghanistan is not a country of oral history. We had historians. Again, I can refer to the Ghaznavid era. For example, Tarikh Bayhaqi, the Bayhaqi's history. He wrote that one almost in 30 volumes. And unfortunately, we lost something around 26 volume of Tarikh Bayhaqi when Genghis Khan attacked Central Asia and South Asia. So you see that how the generation of historiography is going back deep in history, and it's not something new, which should be product of, for example, a modern state, which, of course, when a modern state in Afghanistan established an institution which is called Anjuman Tarikh, Association of History, Historical Association of Afghanistan. So that's the second point. Third, I would like to point out about the trends of historiography in Afghanistan. How many trends can we identify when we talk about either local historians writing in Farsi and Pashto, or maybe international historians? I can identify three, at least. Either some of them are mainstream, but others might not be mainstream. Of course, the very first trend is the one which I think Professor Mousavi highlighted, which is a nationalist historiography. That started with the consolidation of a modern state. And here I would like to quote some of the phrases that of my new book, Negotiating Cultural Diversity, that how history is quite important for the nationalist project and the nationalists. For example, people like Hobsbawm, who is coming from a left background, understand this, and he did say that the past and history is something which is very, very crucial for making of a modern state and nationalism. And he says that historians are to the nationalism what poppy growers in Pakistan are to the heroin addicts. So that kind of very integrated connection is there between talking about past, reclaiming past, and the nationalist project. So this, as Professor Mousavi highlighted, this started not with Anjuman Tarikh in Afghanistan, but much before that one. And there are a couple of main characteristics of this project that maybe I will go through some of them and highlight. The very first characteristic of this nationalist historiography is that it is not a neutral project, and it's not politically free narration of past. It is driven by a certain kind of ideological setup and standpoint. That ideological setup could be anything. Maybe it may come from an ethno-nationalist standpoint. For example, the way the beginning of the country is narrated, right? Ahmad Shah Abdali as the founder of the country, right? We know that how, for example, while you claim such a kind of proposition, you breach, you somehow try to violate that kind of the difference which exists between empire as a polity and a modern state as a polity. Of course, Abdali was a founder of Durrani Empire, but like many other empires which existed earlier before him. So that's why nationalist historiography also emphasizes on continuity. So such kind of differentiation between modern and pre-modern do not exist somehow here. But at the same time, you will also find that while the nationalist historiography emphasizes on on a particular era, for example, 1747, as the beginning of the state here in Afghanistan, what you will recall is that the longer past, maybe the medieval era and maybe the ancient, is lost. Now, emphasizing that Afghanistan was born in 18th century reminds me that like a country like United States or Australia, that they were born in 18th century without any kind of rich history which existed in the past, right? So while the nationalist historiography emphasizes on continuity, but at the same time, there is a kind of contradiction within the same project, wherein they loses the longer past, the ancient past. I'm sure that Professor Mousavi provided so many examples of this that elaborates my point also. The second element of nationalist historiography is they emphasize on racial superiority. Racism is quite central to their argument. For example, Professor Abdullahi Habibi, who was member of Anjuman al-Tarikh, he has a book titled History of Afghanistan from Ancient Times Till the End of Genghis Khan. And this was published in 1967, right? So in this, when you go through the book, you find out the author is subscribing to the theory of migration of Aryans in South Asia, right? And he talks about how this race came from Central Asia, and while they attacked South Asia, that led to decline of Indus Valley civilization. Such kind of assumptions, now the recent historical findings and our archaeological finding indicates that Indus Valley does not confirm this theory of Aryan invasion, right? So, and then it continues. You can give another examples from how, for example, Mahmoud Tarzi and many others like even Ghubar fall in this trap of Aryan superiority and Aryan race, and how Afghanistan and all ethnic groups living in Afghanistan are originating from the same lineage. So that's the second problem of nationalist historiography. The third is that while we have this school of thought or this historiography, it exclusively focuses on history of a state as an institution and history of the nation. But we lose to focus on the fragments of the nation. On many others, for example, we don't know much in Afghanistan about history of arts, history of even democracy, for example, history of, for example, the left movement, right? Because you just exclusively focus on the origination and consolidation of the state. What was the origin of the state? The entire discussion is on that. You go and talk about Ahmad Shah Abdali and then Abdurrahman Khan, Amanullah Khan, the independence and all that movement, right? And even in that movement, what you see when you observe is all elites, the king and the leadership, the rule of many others who are not political elite. That's missing. And that's why this connects me to the second school of thought, which we don't have in Afghanistan, unfortunately, and that could be called subaltern studies. Subaltern studies is a strong South Asian school of historiography, where they emphasize on the rule of those group of people who have been suppressed and marginalized and overlooked, while national historiography is documented, right? For example, scholars like Rajneet Guha in India, they founded this school of thought and this school of historiography in 1980s. Now, when I go back and I put the list of historians in Afghanistan, the local historians, I do not find out any historian coming from such kind of standpoint to challenge the colonial mindset, the history of Afghanistan, which has been heavily influenced by colonial narration. For example, Louis Dipali says, all the historians in Afghanistan, while they write and talk about Afghanistan, there is always a footnote of Elphinstone. So that, And you will see the textbooks taught during the first era of the independence, or during Amanullah. The school textbooks, they drive heavily on the colonial resources. So that's why we need an alternative post-colonial perspective to challenge what has been produced by colonial perspective and also reinforced by the nationalist historiography. That is somehow missing. And the third trend could be the left as historians. That we also need to think about whether we had historians coming up and writing from a leftist perspective. And unfortunately, again, we don't have much. But what we have is a number of autobiographies by many politicians or left active. For example, Mubarak, who was part of Hizb al-Khalq during Mahmoudis. He has written a couple of history books. Abdul Wakil has written, Keshman has written, Zahir Tanin has written. Zahir Tanin, he has documented while he was in BBC, but he has a couple of other English articles reflecting on the communist government in Afghanistan. People also argue that Ghubar, who is one of the mainstream historians, and he was also a member of Anjuman al-Tarikh, he is also somehow, when you read Afghanistan, the Masir Tarikh, Afghanistan in the course of history, that you will also observe few glances of left influence. For example, he uses certain jargons or terminologies which are coming from the left literature. For example, feudalism and rule of the revolution and all that. But still, Ghubar was not a pure leftist. He was trying to stay a kind of democrat and speak about democracy, liberation, freedom, and all that. So to conclude, if I just recall what I said, three main schools of thought or trends we can observe and analyze the historiography of Afghanistan. But out of all these three, the dominant one, and I think we can also say that the only trend in historiography of Afghanistan had been the state-driven nationalist historiography, which itself was influenced by colonial literature. Unfortunately, we don't have subaltern school of history, and we didn't have, and so far we don't have a left school of history. Maybe we can talk about some of other points and later on in question and answer session. Thank you. I will stop here.
So rich, Dr. Sadr, and such a useful, I think, template for thinking about where future research could go, which was one of the questions actually that I had asked while we were waiting for you to come online. Let me ask Dr. Sharifi to jump in with a few final thoughts, because he composed this panel. And let me first introduce him. Dr. Omar Sharifi is assistant professor in anthropology at the American University of Afghanistan, also country director of the American Institute of Afghan Studies in Kabul, and wrote a remarkable anthropology dissertation under the supervision of Dr. Barfield at Boston University in cultural anthropology on Nowruz and nationness as the concept as he described it. So Omar, maybe you can share a few reflections having convened this particular conversation in this configuration, and then we'll come back for some final thoughts from the group.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me by now. Can you hear me well? All right, thank you so much. It's rather difficult for me to actually say thank, because I'm in a panel for the first time in my life with Dr. Barfield, which is my supervisor, which was my supervisor, which who actually helped me to, in a way, navigate this kind of tumultuous path of being a scholar, and with you, Dipali, who actually in every level of what I have written in my dissertation guided me, told me, and told me about what to write, and inspired me of how to think. And with Ustad Mousavi, who actually, when I was writing my dissertation, I was introduced with the concept of Afghantar, and it's in your book. and it's kind of rather difficult to kind of explain that. And Omar Sadr is here. He's a published author, so I feel like not being in it's kind of like feeling displaced, but also feeling very honored and privileged to be in this. But I remember when first time I came in terms of Afghanistan studies and in terms of understanding Afghanistan studies. So I came to the office of Professor Barfield and I said, I don't know what to write. I don't know what to say, right? And the moment is just like Afghan scholars who live in Afghanistan, who experienced the Taliban, the Mujahideen, the communists and everything else. And you read a lot and you kind of being lost. And I sat in his office and Professor told, and I talked to him, just, I don't know actually what am I supposed to say? And Professor told me, think about what is most meaningful to you. I'm an anthropologist. So I says, what's meaningful to you? And I said, all right. And especially when you think about Afghanistan in general. And I thought, okay, I have to think about, as a social anthropologist, and I said, what about Nowruz? And he's like, yeah, you remember, you guys have a lot of celebrations. You have a lot of jashns, as we say that, right? Which one survived to define all of you, or at least majority of you together? And I said, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I started to look at the historical documents and everything that is kind of written from time of the Amir Sher Ali Khan, Amir Abdurrahman Khan, and everything else. And specifically the Janda Bala, which is kind of raising the flags in Nowruz festival. And I realized that we had a lot of events that somehow trying to kind of create a sense of nationalism, trying to define ourselves through a sort of a sense of togetherness. All disappeared, except those who were defined by history and certified by culture. And I looked at the Nowruz festival in Mazar Sharif, a place that is kind of the ancient, close to the ancient city of Balkh or Bactria, whatever you call it. And the shrine is dedicated for the Hazrat Ali, the first Imam of the Shia Muslims, and yet the fourth Caliph of the Muslims, and yet everybody gets together and celebrate themselves. And as an anthropologist, it was a moment in which you actually started to think about the bigger questions, looking at a specific event. Now, I'm sitting here and I'm trying to understand and I'm trying to think about what Afghanistan studies means. What are the trends that we actually have to look at ourselves and trying to define ourselves? What is actually for fact that perhaps for the first time in history, at least modern history, since 2001, it's the first generation who are actually privileged to actually think free and express themselves freely. Before that, it was defined by, as Ustad Mousavi said, by like kind of a state-sponsored sense of like how you have to think and explain yourselves, or how you can tell your story, a story of being Afghan, being human beings. And we are literally, I realize that we are actually part of the first generation who are actually have the privilege to think freely, to think about ourselves without a sort of a paternalistic hand to guide us what we have to say. And being free for us who lived through, at least in my generation, who lived through the communist regime under the PDPA, the Mujahideen, who was totally chaos, and more importantly, the Taliban, who you cannot talk, and who in that period you're not allowed to think. And we are the first generation which actually we can explain ourselves. And the best thing I realized in that period is Afghanistan might be a very new country. It's only 300 years old, but the regions of Afghanistan are old. As Professor Barfield written in his book, Bactria, Balkh, Herat, Kabul, Kandahar, and everything else, we find the same, in a way, configurations the same sort of geographical demarcations that was there 2,500 years ago, and we are still defining ourselves. And it still exists in a modern Afghanistan. And yet Afghanistan is also probably, despite being a country that has suffered a lot of wars, suffered definitely a lot of ethno-chauvinism, a lot of problems in our kind of evolution as a nation since our independence in 1919, but yet we are young, but also we are very old. The way we think, the way we imagine ourselves as who we are is actually not just what we are today, but there is a connection with history, with the past. And this past is not just lost past. It's a past that actually defined our present today, and hopefully will define how we have to be. And with all that, when I'm looking at Afghanistan studies and how Afghanistan is and trends in understanding Afghanistan's history, perhaps this is the first time in our history, our modern history, that we're not defining ourselves based on geographical definitions. We are defining ourselves based on civilizational values, civilizational kind of criteria, in which means that we're not just Afghans based defined by like from Turkham to Islam Qala, which is like the border with Pakistan and Iran. But we define ourselves as part of a civilization in which Central Asian and South Asian civilization, which kind of formed Afghanistan, and when I say that to my students in Afghanistan in American university, told me like, oh, we are always been independent. We have never been conquered. And I was telling them like, excuse me, sorry, Professor Barfield, I'm still gonna copy you again. It says like, we've been conquered by Alexander the Great and the Mongols and everybody else. But the point is, after all that period, who is the conquered and who is the conquered? We have this cultural tradition in which kind of enriched by a Persian civilization, by the Persian civilization, by the Turkic civilization, and it kind of formed an Indian civilization that actually constituted and formed what we are today. Today in Kabul, as an anthropologist, when I go and I'm trying to understand what is music, I listen to rubab and tabla and harmonium and all this Indian tradition that kind of is part of our existence. That's what makes us different from what Iranians think about, Persian speakers. And when I think of certain things, there's a Bukhara, there is a Samarkand, there's all these things kind of combined, all these civilizations kind of make us what we are. And knowing that Afghanistan is like the only country in the entire region that's never been colonized directly. And in that sense, whether you're living in the north, in the south, in the central, in the east or west, there is some sense of continuity in Afghanistan that makes it rather unique as how people express themselves. So today, when I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about trends of Afghanistan studies, the best I can say is like, despite the war, despite the Taliban, despite the Trumpism and everything that's happening in this region, at least a new generation of Afghanistan scholars, they don't see themselves kind of confined and defined by a small space. They see themselves as part of a civilization and part of history, a history that's kind of denied to us. We're no longer defined by boundaries. And the new generation of Afghanistan scholars see themselves and trying to define themselves by fact. And we see dissertations and others, like Jawanshir Rasekh and others who write about it, who see themselves as part of a greater civilization of a Central Asian, South Asian. And it's kind of an exciting moment for Afghanistan, but at the same time, living in a time that we are actually witness a lot of killings, a lot of torment, a lot of tragedies to all of us. I think the best thing that came out of all this 40 years of revolution, wars, and devastations is the moment in which we actually have the opportunity to think free. And giving this region and its history the moment to think free and define yourselves in larger terms, I think that's the best thing that actually defined right now Afghanistan's history and Afghanistan's existence. So I don't know what else to say, but thank you for giving me the opportunity to be among all this established and respected scholars, and specifically with my advisor, by God. Thank you. And thank for the Kokar Foundation to actually give us the opportunity, and Insan to actually talk about Afghanistan, not as a country, but as a part of like a civilization. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. I think that's a beautiful set of thoughts to conclude on. I want to give just, Khwaga Jan has told me we can go a little bit long. I wanted to give Dr. Sadr and you the opportunity just to answer the questions that I posed to Dr. Barfield and Dr. Mousavi. In particular, you both are educating the next generation of Afghan scholars. And I wonder if each of you can reflect a little bit on how this very difficult moment among the many difficult moments that have existed in Afghan history, this moment where questions around the type of freedom that you just described, there are questions about the viability of that future, and decisions are being made in Kabul, in Doha, in Washington, in Brussels, that have a real bearing on that. So I wonder if you can share with us, particularly for our Western audiences, what is at stake in terms of the production of knowledge at this particular moment in the war and in the negotiations that are happening. And also, to end on a more academic note, what are the questions that you would like your students to think about, the concepts, the methods that you would like to see them employ that can continue to deepen and enrichen the study of Afghanistan? So Dr. Sadr, maybe we start with you.
Well, thank you for that. I think at this very difficult time that we are located, both spiritual and temporal, I think we need to reflect, all of us, on one concept, and that is the idea of Afghanistan. As I'm looking at this question, I observe that the republic that we have practiced in the last 18 years is challenged deeply by fundamentalists, by ethno-nationalists, by the corrupt, fanatic political elite in and outside of the government. And one of the deep crises goes to the fact that we, all of us, have not conceptualized what do we mean by Afghanistan. The idea of Afghanistan has remained under-theorized. I mean, okay, so it's connected with the issue that we discussed now, the history, right? Is this country ancient? Is this country modern? What are the values driven as to create certain institutions at the moment, right? Be it Islamic Republic, right? What values should define Afghanistan? What ideas should define Afghanistan? These are questions that we have not answered yet. And I think it's because most of the institutions, most of the organizations, and whatever we practice now, unfortunately, they were dropped from outside. And little effort has been made to think, and somehow connect this with our own socio-political context. For example, this idea of republic, as I said, to many of us here in Afghanistan, what do we mean by republic? Be it philosophical by the school of republicanism, civic republicanism, or maybe Islamic Republic. It's not conceptually clear for us. So that's why it's very easy for militant terrorist groups like Taliban to come and challenge these institutions very easily, right? Because it has very shaky conceptual ground. And it's easily someone will come and say, okay, these are foreign values, foreign institutions. And so that's why I think we need to, as a nation, as a people, we need to go back and reflect. And that reflection includes our going back to our history, being critical, because as I explained earlier, unfortunately, history of Afghanistan and whatever is available to us in our own national languages, it's mainly descriptive, it's mainly uncritical, and it's political. For example, I really like to see certain works which has been produced elsewhere. For example, Jonathan Lee's book very recently, or B.P. Hopkins' Making of Modern Afghanistan, which really challenges the foundations of epistemic foundations of us here. How do we know, and what is our understanding of selfhood? So that's missing. We need to be critical of our history, and we need to come and conceptualize the idea of Afghanistan. And that's quite important for me, I think.
Wonderful. That's really helpful. Dr. Sharifi?
Oh, well, because of the time constraints and stuff, I think that given what I've said before, we are actually looking all this sort of like the realities that's kind of shaped modern Afghanistan, realities. I don't know if you can see me. Can you see me? All right. The realities of modern Afghanistan is like we have millions of people who are actually born and grown in the refugee camps in Pakistan and Iran. And a lot of them just now are living in Afghanistan, shaping it. What I'm thinking about modern Afghanistan is like we are in the, given that it's the first time that you actually are allowed and have the opportunity to think freely. We are in the process of a cultural rebirth. And that, in an academic way, that means that we have the opportunity to look at our historical past, good or bad, with a critical eye. And we have the opportunity actually to not only criticize it, but actually analyze it. And I think in the situation in which Taliban are coming and Doha talks are happening and Khalilzad is going around and saying a lot of these things, despite all of it, there's more in Afghanistan that's kind of seen on the surface. People want to say that we are doomed or gloomed because of what's happening in Washington or in Doha, or most likely in Rawalpindi and Islamabad. But what matters is right now for the last 20 years, there's a generation emerged in Afghanistan actually are trained, not only trained, but actually grown up and have to think for themselves, to think not only for themselves as individuals, but think for themselves as community. And translating it into kind of an academic way, this is the first time in our history in which we look at our historical past, at the texts, not only produced by the Afghan scholars, but also for the international scholars, with a critical eye, without emotions, sometimes with emotions, but mostly without emotions, and trying to understand who we are and what we are. And it's a time that actually we're trying to redefine ourselves in a world that is sometimes chaotic, but also mostly small. So I don't know if there is a clear or like a definite answer to your questions and stuff, but what I can say is about my experience with my students. When the COVID hit Kabul, when there was no help by the government, when there was no support by anybody else, there was the community who actually mobilized themselves. They raised the money and helped themselves with the help from the internationals and their networks from the past, but they actually kept us alive. When actually a lot of Afghans, as you know, I'm thinking as an anthropologist, I'm talking as an anthropologist right now. When a lot of Afghans actually, what we call them the daily workers and stuff, when they didn't have money to actually live the next day, and you either have to work today or you die tomorrow. And it was the communities that actually sort of raised the money, mobilized their networks, and sort of sustained themselves. And that is, to me, is probably the most authentic definition of what Afghanistan is. And they're not some sort of an isolated communities. They are communities that are connected. And because of their connections, they managed to survive. And they managed to live. So all I can say is like, this is a generation that despite what Taliban says, what happens in Doha, or God knows what's Zalmay Khalilzad is doing and stuff, we have now the means and actually the opportunity to think for ourselves and to think what it means to be human, what it means to live in dignity, and trying to mobilize ourselves. So this is a new Afghanistan. If anybody says Afghanistan hasn't changed, I'm telling you, just come to Kabul, go to Kandahar, visit Herat, have a dinner in Takhar or Kunduz. You will know Afghanistan has changed quite a lot in the last 20 years. It has unprecedented in our history. Thank you.
I think that's a great note to end on. Hwagajan, let me invite you into the conversation. We can't see you or hear you. There you are.
Good evening from Kabul. First of all, thank you very much for this very interesting discussion and the great intervention from Omar Jan, which makes us very hopeful. I would like to take this opportunity on behalf of Askar History Foundation to thank everyone for watching our programs. Our entire expectation was that we provide an opportunity for scholars such as yourself to have an opportunity to discuss and debate some of the historical events, which I hope we've managed to do that. In addition to that, we've had other events, which you can get all of that information from our web pages. At the same time, I would like to take this opportunity to actually announce a few forthcoming books published by Askar Foundation that you need to keep your eyes open for. One book which was mentioned by Dr. Barfield, and actually I've seen it that you've mentioned it as one of the 5 books to be read somewhere in 2012 or at some point, the political and diplomatic history of Afghanistan. With the help of a family friend, Mr. Nasimi, who's in California, he's actually translated that book into Pashto and in very simple, straightforward Pashto, so the Pashtun audience are able to read that book in Pashto. And tonight, Insan Institution will launch the audio book of that book as well. So now you can have access to the book and you can listen to it as well. In addition to the audiobook, we have a few other books that are coming up very soon, actually, in the next month or so. One book, which is titled In Search of Peace for Afghanistan, President Mohammad Najibullah and Dr. Hassan Kakar's 3 rare historical letters. It's an edited volume of collection of about 33 articles from Afghanistan-based and international scholars such as Dipali, and we have Omar as well, who have contributed to this book. And this is on topics related to peacemaking. And this book is edited by Dr. Jawan Shirasakh. And the book is actually inspired by the discovery of 3 letters that were exchanged between my father and President Najibullah, regarding the reconciliation process of the 1990s. The book will be launched by the end of February. That's one book. Another book, Journey to Homeland, the Taliban and Islamic Fundamentalism. This is a book that my father wrote in 2001, and it's basically writing about his trips to Afghanistan, his trip to Afghanistan, and he traveled to Kandahar as well. So he basically described his observation of Afghans under the Taliban regime, and further discusses the history of fundamentalism. And with the help of Omar and the American Institute for Afghanistan Studies, this book has been translated into English, and we will be publishing it soon. Another piece of book which will be published as well, it's a new title, The Young Kakar's Writing. It's basically, we came across some of his early writings, some of 55 articles that he wrote for various Afghan newspapers in 1958 and 1963. So this book is on various topics such as history, sociology, and politics. And that book is also going to be published and launched very, very soon. So now I give the floor to my colleague, Fahim Karim from Insan Institute, to make the last announcement for this history week. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dipali and Dr. Thomas و دکتر شریفی، دکتر موسوی و دکتر صدر. خیلی تشکر از یک بحث خیلی فوق‌العاده و عالی و در حالت خیلی خوبی که ما قرار داریم و این بحث صورت گرفت و ما امروز در ششمین روز هفته تاریخ قرار داریم که اتفاقا فردا هفتمین روز و از فردا اتفاقا ما یک کلوزینگ سرمونی میخواد داشتیم. در این میان کوششی است که ما در آخری مباحث در آخری هفته تبادله نامه هایی که میان دکتر نجیب الله و دکتر حسن کاکر صورت گرفته هم نشر خواهد شد از طرف بنیاد تاریخ کاکر هم به زبان پشتو هم دری و هم انگلیسی. و در این میان ما همچنان یکی از کتاب‌های اختصاصی که در مجله های آریانا و وگما و کابل نشر شده از طرف پانسر کاکر به نام The جوان کاکر افکار که به زبان پشتو خواهد بود او هم نشر خواهد شد از طرف بنیاد تاریخ کاکر. و در این میان دو کتابی که قرار است که به زبان پشتو و به صورت آدیو پشتو به ژبه او په رادیو په غږیز ډول به نشر شي. یو د کاکر یو ځانګړې ژباړه د جان سټارټ میل په نیمه دقیقو کې چې د هغه نظریات دي او دوهم هم د افغانستان سیاسي حکومتي تاریخ دی چې د انسان له لوري په غږیز ډول برابر شوی دی ډېر ژر به خپور شي. همدا ډول افغانستان او په هندوستان فارس او افغانستان کې دولت جوړول په موخه دوی د حذف لنډیز دا هم په دریو پښتو ژبو ژباړل شوی دی او دا به هم ډېر ژر نشر شي چې له دري څخه پښتو ته ژباړل شوی دی. په همدې ډول باندې به د پښتون افغان او افغانستان یوه رساله چې د کاکړ په اثارو کې ډېر ځانګړی او مهم ځای لري هغه به هم په نږدې راتلونکي کې نشر شي د دوهم ځل لپاره. په دې ډول باندې زموږ نن له دې سیشن سره زموږ د تاریخ د اونۍ ټول بحثونه پای ته رسیږي او ډېر ژر به موږ د راتلونکي کال د بحثونو یوه فوق‌العاده لړۍ د دې بحثونو له تجربو څخه په ګټه اخیستنې پیل کوو. له ډاکټر ډیپالي، د ډاکټر توماس، دکتر عمر شریفی، دکتر موسوی خیلی ممنون دکتر صاحب تشریف آوردین به بحثی که ما خیلی بعد از وقتا صحبت شما رو شنیدیم در یکی از مباحث و دکتر صاحب صدر که آشنایی خیلی خوبی داشتیم با ایشان مگر امروز خیلی فرصت واقع شد که صحبتاشون رو بشنویم. خیلی ممنون به این بحث خیلی مهمه که درباره جناح‌های معاصر تاریخ نویسی افغانستان بود اشتراک کردیم و توقع داریم که در آینده ها هم بتانیم در تاریخ نویسی و مباحث تاریخ افغانستان به هم باشیم. خیلی ممنون.
I'm sorry, Dipali, I'll have to correct myself. I made a mistake. Journey to Homeland, the Taliban and Islamic Fundamentalism. That book was actually written in Pashto, so it has been translated into English. Thank you.
I mean, AIS is translating it into Pashto, from Pashto to English, by the way, just to correct it more.
I think that's what you said initially. That was what I understood. I think we are ready. We're almost half an hour over time. We've kept our audience captive, but it's been such a rich and interesting conversation. I want to thank again Khwagajan and Fahim and Omar for all of the work of pulling this panel and the whole week together. It's been an extraordinarily rich set of conversations. I would urge everyone to go to the Facebook pages of both the foundation and the institution to catch up on all of the previous conversations and maybe even come back and rewatch this one. There was so much rich that was shared. It's just a joy to see everyone here, and thank you for your time, and look forward to reading all of these great books and also all of the dissertations that have been inspired, no doubt, by this conversation. So good evening in Kabul and good afternoon in the US, and look forward to seeing you all in person soon, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you so much. Thank
Khudafez.
you, Barfield. Thank you, Dipali John. Thank you, Ustad.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a nice
Can I
time.
have 1 minute, please?
Oh, of course.
Dipali. By the way, please also have a look at, can you read it?
Also,
you
we
read
can
Yes,
see
yes.
it. It's
Sorry,
read
Afghanistan.
Ottawa Hang. Okay.
It's
Sorry,
very
Afghanistan.
new and it's in plastic. This is also, it's a very good, very critical, and present a new approach to the history of Afghanistan. It's just published, well, maybe about a couple of months, but it was not, there was no launch, there was no distribution as such, either because of Corona or because of whatever. And I just
Contact
suggest please have
AIS.
a look at that one.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Mousavi. I hope, Khwajajan, we can maybe have some
Well,
bibliography of all the works that have been referenced over the week. That would be wonderful to share.
Definitely, we will have an entire report sent out to everyone.
Okay, marvelous.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all.
thank you.
Thank you.
Khudafez.
Khudafez.
Yes.